Welcome to our Women's Bible Study as we look at the 7 letters to the churches in Revelation. Today we're going to be looking at the 3rd letter, the letter to the church at Pergamum. Pergamum was a major city in the Roman Empire. It was the capital of Asia. And they were famous for 2 temples that were very strong and very powerful and very influential. And the first one was this temple to Caesar. It was the center of the emperor cult where people worshiped Caesar as Lord. They had a confession that they would make together, and they would chant it together in their worship, and that is, Caesar is Lord. And also there was a temple to Asclepius. He was the god of healing, and he was represented by the symbol of a snake. Many of you have seen this symbol where you have a staff and 2 snakes intertwined, perhaps with some wings at the top of the staff. And it still represents the medical profession and services today in our culture. This made Pergamum a very important city. The worship of Caesar, and also the place that people came to with their diseases and their health concerns. Now, when Christians would look at these temples, it was really difficult for them because for them, Jesus is Lord. And also, Christians believed that God was the one who healed, not a snake, because in the Christian culture, the snake represented Satan, the devious deceiver who is always trying to get people to focus on him and not God. This put Christians in a very difficult situation where the entire city was focused on Caesar and supportive of Caesar, and also the temple to Asclepius for healing. Christians were oftentimes ostracized and persecuted in Pergamum because they said Jesus was Lord, and they knew that God was a God of healing. So the church at Pergamum is a church that's being persecuted, and it's a church that is struggling. So Jesus represents himself in this letter as the judge. He is the one that has the sharp, double-edged sword, and he is the one who is going to be the final judge and arbitrator of all things. Jesus tells the Christians at Pergamum, he says, I know where you live, where Satan has his throne. And this is the cult worship of Asclepius that he's talking about. Yet you remain true to my name. You did not renounce your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was put to death in your city where Satan lives. This is a reminder of the persecution that these Christians were under. Antipas, we know really nothing about him, but he was someone who stood up against the worship of Asclepius, and he was martyred for that. And Jesus says, I know what you're going through. I know how hard it is for you to be there in a government and in a culture that is persecuting you. So Jesus has a heart for these people. But Jesus goes on and he says, I have a few things against you. He says, you have people there in your church who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and committing sexual immorality. Jesus is reminding the people at Pergamum of a story in their history in the book of Numbers, chapters 22 and 24. It talks about a prophet by the name of Balaam. And he was a prophet for hire. He would give prophecies and blessings and curses for money. Balaam was a king who was afraid of the growing influence of the children of Israel. So he went and he hired Balak to go and pronounce a curse on them, but God intervened. And rather than curses, all that was able to come out of his mouth were blessings. When that didn't work, then Balak told Balaam the king how he could put a plot to seduce the Israelites to come to them and join a feast. And as a result of this, God's judgment came upon the people of Israel who participated in this, and there was a plague. So there were deadly consequences to this. And this story, which the people at Pergamum knew very well, Jesus relates and says, likewise, you also have those who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. And we talked about them in the last letter, and the Nicolaitans were a group of people in the church that said, it's okay to compromise your faith. Your spirit can be with God, but you can do what you want to with regard to idols and the culture and the things that you associate with. And Jesus is very much against this kind of compromise. So what Jesus is doing, he's equating that story of Balaam and Balak with what's going on among them with people that are sympathetic to the teachings of the Nicolaitans. What he is saying is he is against that compromise because it denigrates Jesus and is offensive to the faith that he calls us to live. And so he says, repent, therefore, otherwise I will soon come to you and I will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. In other words, Jesus is going to have the last word. And how we live and the confession we make and the practices that we bind ourselves here has a great bearing on our faith life and our relationship to Jesus. Because this kind of compromise, Jesus is saying, I don't tolerate. Jesus goes on to say, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Listen up. Listen to this word and heed it. I believe that this letter has a lot to say to us today in our culture. That Jesus wants us to be lights in this world, and that is to be very clear about what we believe and what we teach. And we believe that Jesus sits on the throne of all things through all eternity. And our hearts are totally committed to him. So Jesus is saying to us, be very careful about the deceiver. He wants you to think that you can compromise. And this is something that impacts the church because the church at Pergamum was a church that was somewhat divided. Many people said that aligning themselves with some of the practices that were going on in their culture was okay. But Jesus says very clearly, it's not. Jesus wants us to be very careful about the picture we paint for people to see about what we believe and who we follow. There is always the temptation to compromise our faith, that you can put church and Jesus in this little box, but in terms of your lifestyle and the things you do, it's okay for you to follow what everyone else is doing in the culture. And this is not okay with Jesus. In fact, he is calling them and encouraging them to step toward him in faith and follow him faithfully in faith. He goes on to say in verse 17, he says, he who has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give some hidden manna. Manna is an image that goes way back in the time when the children of Israel were wandering in the desert. And God provided them with food on the ground, manna that sustained them through all of those years of wandering. And what Jesus is saying is, I'm going to take care of you. I am going to feed you. Jesus told his disciples, I am the bread of life. And Jesus is saying is that you can trust me, that I will take care of you. I will feed you. I will sustain you. And isn't this a message that we need to hear right now in our culture, in our time, with all the uncertainty that's going on around us? Right now, in our culture, there is a lot of fear and uncertainty. There's a lot of insecurity because so many things are changing around us. and we wonder about the future. And Jesus is speaking to us. He is the one that's in charge. He is the one that's in control. And we can absolutely trust him because he will be there for us. He will care for us. He will provide for us. He says, and I will also give him a white stone with a new name on it, known only to him who receives it. This is a mysterious promise about something that will happen in heaven. And that is that Jesus will give you a white stone and you will see that there is a name on it. You know, in the scriptures, when God gives you a name, then it explains things, who you are, what he has called you to do, the destiny that he has in his heart for your life. And what he's saying is that be faithful through this time of struggling. Be faithful through this time of doubts when you're not really quite sure which way to go and what to do. And people in the culture are telling you one thing and your faith is telling you something else. Jesus is saying be faithful. And what he means is the day is going to come in heaven when I'm going to give you stone and there'll be a name on it. And when you look at that name, you will know it. It will be this aha moment where now I see, now I understand. And all of those things that today perplex us, the questions, why this pandemic, why is our culture transitioning and changing? Why are there so many things that are happening now and maybe you're suffering and maybe you're insecure about the future? The day is going to come when you look at that name on that stone in heaven and you'll say, now I understand. Now I understand what you are up to. Now I understand what my life was all about. And it will be a moment of joy and understanding that will be a part of your identity in all eternity. The church at Pergamum was a church that was divided. They were struggling with themselves over issues and what was going on in their world. And some of them were being persecuted and suffering. And Jesus in this letter is saying, I am going to have the last word. I will take care of you. I will be with you. Be faithful. You know, tonight you're going to have a great time discussing this letter to the church at Pergamum because it really speaks to us and what's going on in our culture where we have everyone speaking to us about science and mandates and who knows best about the future. And it's really easy to get caught up in that. But we as Christians know that God's in charge, that our life and our future is in his hands. Maybe tonight would be a real good time for you to talk among yourselves about how you feel about what's going on in our culture, how it's impacting your family and your life, and how you're feeling and how you're thinking. This is going to be a good time to encourage one another, to share words of faith about how Jesus is always there and he's going to be there with you in these moments. And I also believe that this is a time of great opportunity for us as Christians, because never before have we sensed as much lack of clarity. Some people call it a darkness. And in these dark times and uncertain times, it's a time when we can let our light shine. So this letter was a call to Christians to come back and be solidly following Jesus Christ in faith. And it's the same word that Jesus is giving us today. We can trust him. May God bless you and may you have a wonderful study.